Aggro decks are definitely not dead, because this aggro priest was able to reach rank 1 legend. Banpei was able to reach rank 1 legend on the Asia server, and I'm not sure if he was able to climb to rank 1 legend or if he was the first person to hit legend, but to do so with this specific deck is honestly very impressive, because this has got to be one of the weirdest constructed decks that I've ever seen. And since I couldn't find any data on this deck on HS Replay, I decided to try out this deck for myself. And what I can conclude is that this deck stomps rogues and it stomps druids. One key factor of this deck is the element of surprise, because nobody is going to expect the Void Touch Attendant on turn 1, followed by the emote to assert dominance. However, the element of surprise can only get you so far, because once our board is wiped out, it's really hard for us to squeeze in that last bit of damage. In one game in particular, I had tried to go for lethal by playing Bless on my minion, but I had miscalculated and was 1 damage off lethal. My opponent was able to stabilize, and then there was no way for me to get that one last bit of damage. So when this kind of situation happens, you have one of 2 options. Number 1, you have to play for maximum board effects, so that way you are always having a minion on the field, because the only way that you're going to be able to win is to storm face immediately. You need minion pressure, because the only cards that give you any sort of chances for immediate damage are Mancrick and Sir Fenley Murgleton. And honestly, I believe these cards are probably going to be core in order for this deck to see any sort of play. There aren't too many spells, so being able to play Mancrick into Thrive of Shadows is a combo that a lot of players are already familiar with. And Sir Finley Murgleton gives you the possibility of being able to high roll the Hunter hero power, which did make a difference in one of my games. But it's also just a 1/3 minion that works perfectly with Serpent Wig, Focus Will, as well as Bless to create a large minion as quickly as possible. And there are some situations where you do want to just play Bless on turn 2 or turn 3. Because especially in this metagame, the only answer to this combo is Smothering Starfish. And luckily you still have cards like Pelagos, Boon of the Ascended, as well as Serpent Wigs in order to give you amazing potential of making big minions one after another. Now before we get into the mulligan of this deck, I would like to point out some of the interesting single inclusions in this deck that actually make a lot of sense. Starting with Focused Will. Focused Will is a great card to give you an additional buff if you're trying to go for an early Bless target. But since we run Najak Hexen in this deck, it's also a great way of being able to steal a minion, so if your opponent plays a big Edwin or a gigantic taunt, you don't have to worry about just playing the Focused Will on that card. But that possibility is still there in case you need to go for a quick lethal. Next, we have 1 copy of Thrive in the Shadows. Honestly, you're not really too concerned with playing spells in this deck because you'd rather focus on the immediate threats. So you're usually going to use Thrive in the Shadows in order to fish for a Bless if you're trying to go for lethal. And if you think about it, with only 1 Thrive in the Shadows in the deck, you will never find another Thrive in the Shadows whenever you play it. Meaning that the cards that you find from Thrive in the Shadows are actually going to be useful. And luckily this card can be tutored by Twilight Deceptor, but there are a decent amount of other shadow cards in this deck that you can draw, so it's not guaranteed. And there are some situations where Shadow Word Devour is just better because you're either trying to clear a board or get an insane Pelagos value. Next is Boon of the Ascended. Keep in mind, this is Aggro Priest, not Boon Priest. We have a whole nother deck list that's completely dedicated to making Boon of the Ascended as nutty as possible. But in this deck, it just incentivizes the perfect 1, 2, 3, 4 curve if you're able to pop off that consistently. Because if you bless a minion on turn 3 and then play Boon of the Ascended on turn 4, there are a lot of decks that cannot deal with that pressure. But it's just another way of making another big minion and snowballing games that you already have the advantage. So running a second copy in this deck would slow down what this deck is already efficient at. Next is Partner in Crime. Honestly, this card is really good if you have turn 3 Cathedral of Atonement. So when we talk about the mulligan, I'm going to bring up a lot of cards that you're supposed to keep in combination with each other. But Partner in Crime is just a good way of being able to spread out your resources when you're already ahead, so that way Blessed becomes that much more threatening. One reason why it's particularly frustrating to go up against this archetype is because every minion suddenly becomes a threat, especially if it has a large amount of HP. So Partner in Crime may not be the star of this deck, but it does have its purposes. Same thing with these next 2 cards that have probably raised a lot of eyebrows already. Spirit Guide and Battleground Battlemaster. While I'm not 100% sold on Battleground Battlemaster, Spirit Guide is actually an insane card in this deck. Because if you look closely, Bless and Boon of the Ascended are the only holy spells available in the deck. So Spirit Guide can be a great way of being able to stabilize your already developed board while giving you your win condition immediately. I love the idea of making this card a 2-of, but again, we're playing Aggro Priest, we're not playing Midrange Priest. Which is the main reason why I'm not really sold on Battleground Battlemaster, because this card just seems like a win more card. There haven't been a lot of games to where the Wind Fury has mattered, but there have been times where I just draw this card and I have no use for it. This card just seems like a win more card and doesn't actually give us more percentages in games that we're struggling against. But for now, I'm going to keep an open mind because this card does have insane potential. Now let's talk about the Mulligan. Unfortunately, there's no official HS replay stats in order to look into because this archetype hasn't become that popular yet. So I'm going to be using data from the 19 games that I've already played with this deck to where I've ended with an 11-8 record. Keep in mind that this data is not 100% reflective of how powerful this deck is, but it does give us an idea of which cards are the most powerful. The highest Mulligan win rate cards in this deck were Void Touched Attendant, Cathedral of Atonement, and Serpent Wig. And I would argue that you want to keep these cards 100% of the time. Void Touched Attendant is just a perfect way of being able to steamroll the game immediately and to showcase how serious you are about your Aggro Priest tendencies. But the main reason why this card is so effective in the Mulligan is because the 1-3 stat line is insane with all the buffs that you have. If you play Void Touched Attendant on turn 1 and your opponent can't clear it, you play Serpent Wig and you make it into a 2-5. And then after playing Cathedral of Atonement, you have this large minion that just cannot be removed. The only weakness at this point becomes Smothering Starfish. And you have plenty of other ways of being able to develop the board after that happens. Some other cards that I usually kept in the Mulligan were Twilight Deceptor, Pelagos, Iron Deep Trog, as well as Crooked Cook. Pelagos is usually great against Druid, but the main reason why I always kept this card was to see how consistently I could get its value. But if you have Serpent Wig ready to go, you could argue that keeping Pelagos is very powerful. Especially if you have the coin, you can make Pelagos a turn 3 8/8. We all know how good Iron Deep Trog is against the Druid matchup, but I would say that this card is not usually what you want to play on turn 1 every single game. So whenever you're given the opportunity to play Trog against Druid, definitely go for it, but this isn't the safe turn 1 every single time. In fact, I would argue that Vicious Slither Spear is a better 1-drop than Iron Deep Trog in most of your games. But unfortunately, my data is just not reflective of that right now, because the one game where I ended up playing Vicious Slither Spear, I didn't end up winning. And this is why we need more data in order to figure out how powerful this deck actually is. Because I definitely know that Vicious Slither Spear is supposed to be one of the most consistent minions in this deck. And when you look at its draw and win rate, it does start to reflect that. So the next time that you're looking at stats, make sure that you're really looking into what they actually mean. But I would argue that these are the most safe cards to keep in your Mulligan depending on which matchups you happen to fight. And last but not least, let's look into what this deck is favored into. Because as I told you guys earlier, I had an 11-8 record with this deck. In my testing, I started with a 5-1 record, and then I quickly jumped to an 8-3 record. And I quickly started thinking that this deck was nuts. But then suddenly, I ran into mages. And I gotta say, this is probably gotta be one of the worst matchups that I can conceive in Hearthstone. Because even with one of the best curves that I had against mage, I could not get a win against this class. And when you look at the data for Banpei, he actually only saw 2 mages on his climb. Probably because a lot of people were trying to get the quick rank 1 legend at the beginning of the season. So playing mage was not the greatest way in order to get fast, easy wins. But if you look at the data, it has insane matchups against druid as well as rogue. So I'm fine with being net negative against mages and priests as long as I'm slaughtering everything else on the meta. And remember, you're playing aggro priest. Nobody is going to expect you to be playing this archetype right now. But if you're looking for an unexpected deck to take to the ladder, or maybe an archetype that might be really good after we get some nerfs, this might be worth looking into. Because I was completely shocked at how consistently this deck was performing in the first couple of games that I played with it. But it's also worth noting that this deck's average game is about 5 minutes. So if you're just not trying to spend all day playing druid and mage mirrors, then finally we can play some old-fashioned Hearthstone. And if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel for even more content. As always, I hope you guys do well in your ranked games. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video, and we'll see you for the next one.